colleagues, and shape what is instructionally possible. And we're really excited about what she's going to share with us today. And I just wanted to make one comment that after Dr. Horn's presentation, there'll be food and a chance to interact more informally afterwards.
Hi, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I always love these opportunities to get to visit new campuses and see the things people are doing in math education and teacher education. And I've had a really interesting couple of days visiting with folks from the center and the College of Education here. So I usually like to take these opportunities when I'm invited to give a talk like this to sort of a mixed audience of practitioners, people in education, people in mathematics and the sciences, to kind of think with you about, sort of share what I'm thinking. So although I'm going to share some sort of pre-digested research in a way, I'm going to repackage it in a way that is informing the kinds of problems I'm thinking about right now. So as you see, the title of my talk is An Asset Orientation is Everything: How Strengths-Based Perspectives on Math Teaching Help Students and Teachers. So I will work up to why that is the title of my talk. First, let me tell you, I am on Twitter. Feel free to tweet. I will not look at you askance if you are on your phone or device doing things. I will, even if you're texting your teenage kid, I will think you're tweeting. So. So who am I? What do I do? I listen to teachers. And most of the data that I've collected over the years is I focus my camera, I focus my recording device, I sit down listening to teachers, math teachers mostly, talking about their instruction. It's not a common way of doing educational research, but it's been really fruitful for the things I care about. And I do this because it's a way for me to critique teacher education. Teacher education traffics in shoulds and oughts. It traffics in ideals. It talks about the best practices, the things we want to see in schools. And we need that vision. But I think some of the reason that we have this persistent problem of preparing teachers in a certain vein, and then they go out into classrooms and things don't quite work well, they fall apart in various ways, is because there's a gap between the schools that should be and the schools that are, and teachers are the ones living in that gap. So in other words, the realities of schools and classrooms are not always captured in the ideals that we talk about in teacher education or in professional development for that matter. I like to sometimes say that my work is trying to understand where the rubber meets the road. I'm not trying to abdicate ideals. I think we need ideals. We should all strive together for the schools that we want to have and the classrooms that we want to have, but we need to do a better job of accounting for all the different challenges teachers and classrooms have to contend with. So, in other words, my goal in the research that I do is to bring math teachers' lived realities in schools into educational research, into teacher preparation, and in professional development. So, I know not all of you are math people, so I'm going to give you a little quick tour of what the current ideals are in math education, so you can kind of understand. I don't know, would that be the rubber or the road? I guess that's the rubber. I don't know. So right now, the way we talk a lot in math education about what we're aiming for is we use this phrase, ambitious instruction. And we often contrast it with typical instruction, traditional instruction. And I'm going to give you a real quick rundown of these differences. So in typical instruction, teachers present ideas effectively. They attend to students' correct answers. Mathematics itself is kind of this ready-made thing that's pulled off the shelf. The textbook is the authority. There's a sequence of topics that must be adhered to. If you don't understand fractions, you can't learn variables yet. Like that sequence, that hierarchy is really something to adhere to. Students, to be a successful math student, you need to be a quick and accurate calculator, and you need to complete your work. And that is a really quick and dirty version of what traditional math instruction looks like in our schools. Ambitious instruction is trying to move the dial, and it's changing all three of these things. Teachers, instead of presenting ideas effectively and attending to correct answers, they need to be designers of effective learning environments. They need to center their instruction on student thinking. Mathematics has shifted as well. Instead of being this ready-made, off-the-shelf, it's something that can be inquired into, investigated. It's something that students can create themselves. Instead of the sequence of topics that dominates, there is a network of connected ideas and concepts that students can explore and investigate, and that recur throughout the curriculum. Student success becomes about modeling and interpreting the world mathematically and being sense makers, being good sense makers. So teachers are kind of caught in the middle of this because schools are really set up for what's on the left-hand column, and we're asking teachers to practice in a way that looks more like the right-hand column. So that's sort of my rubber and road right there. And there are a lot of documents that have come out sort of espousing this view. This is a pretty consensus view in the field of math education. The last document right there, the blue one, is the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics' most recent document called Principles to Actions. And there's this lovely list in there about mathematics teaching practices that's more specific than I think anything I've seen yet. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them for you. So one really important practice in this new vision of ambitious math teaching is eliciting student thinking. Because if we're going to build instruction on how students think, we need to get them to share their ideas, right? That's a really important practice. Another one is facilitating meaningful discourse. If students are going to be sense makers, they need to be able to have good conversations and rich conversations about mathematics, and teachers need to be able to facilitate that. I'm just going to take those two examples from this long list so that you can follow the thread of the rest of my talk. So the takeaway I want you to bring forward is this idea that classroom discussion is a really highly valued practice in this vision of ambitious mathematics instruction. So you want to know how it's looking out there? Okay. So this is our MIST. We were having a conversation at lunch about this acronym. I guess it's a popular acronym if you have mathematics or something, or some. You don't have, your M isn't math. It's masters. Oh, yeah. See, ours actually has the I, and apparently this is what made the Germans giggle. But so for the past 10 years, I've only been a part of the study for the last 5 years. We have had a research team looking at instructional improvement in school districts, in urban school districts. And these districts had invested in sort of all the right things to improve mathematics instruction. And we were really interested in how they were improving mathematics instruction in the middle grades. As a part of our data collection, the part of how we tracked improvement over time is once a year we would ask a sample of teachers, middle grades teachers, to show us their best lesson. And they'd been getting all the messaging from the district. They got all the curriculum from the districts. So they kind of knew where the bar was. And we said, put on the dog and pony show, show us your best lessons, which we video recorded and coded. What did we find? We found that less of half of these lessons included any class discussion. Of that half, less than half of those that had class discussion went beyond, what did you get, what did you get, what did you get? Which is kind of eliciting student thinking, but it's not really rich mathematical discourse. So in these places where they are deliberately focusing on helping working teachers develop ambitious mathematics instruction, we did not see that happening very much. When we talked to teachers about it, they said it's really hard to get kids to share their ideas. They would go to these PDs, they might be pumped up, they might read the curriculum, they might feel inspired by a coach, but then they'd ask kids to tell what they think, and kids didn't really want to share their ideas. So this is a really hard practice. And even when teachers are getting really targeted support to help them have mathematical conversations with their students, it's not easy to do. And I want to say that because I feel very humble about that. And this is part of what I enjoy about spending a lot of time with practicing teachers, is it keeps me very humble about just how hard these visions that we put out in these documents are to actually accomplish in schools. But it does beg this question: if we want to move more teachers towards ambitious instruction, if we're convinced by the consensus view in the field that ambitious instruction represents the best possible form of mathematics teaching, what are the key levers for shifting practice? So my current read of the findings is the title of this talk. And asset orientation is everything for math teachers who are trying to improve their instruction. Okay, that's a little bit dramatic, but the more measured version is an asset orientation is necessary but not sufficient for math teachers to improve their practice. My point is that it's really a linchpin, and it's something that I think we too often overlook. And whenever I'm writing a talk, I think of it sort of a little bit as a storytelling opportunity, and what I want you to, the moral of the story to be for you. I really want you to understand how critical this asset orientation is to the work that I think a lot of us are invested in doing. Okay, so what do I mean by an asset orientation? An asset orientation is when teachers look at kids and look at their students and really try to understand their strengths. They really try to value them as whole people. And there's a lot of ideas like this out there in educational research. There's this idea of Louis Small and colleagues about funds of knowledge. Django Paris has this idea of culturally sustaining pedagogies. Special ed is replete with strengths-based approaches. There's a lot of discourse around this idea of investing in students' strengths. So why am I bringing a new term? Because I don't quite mean any of those things, and I'm sorry for that. Being a social scientist, that's sort of what we do. But I'm constructing it as an asset orientation as a way of building a contrast. So what is not an asset orientation? Labeling kids in ways that demean them, denigrate them, put them in a box, like lazy. Even something that seems more descriptive, like a C student, but that ends up sort of essentializing a student's capability, can be not an asset orientation. Even things that we mean well by, again, trying to be descriptive, can sometimes have connotations that end up invoking deficit frameworks, even if they're not intended to be more than descriptive. So even words like at risk, which sometimes can be useful for describing certain circumstances students find themselves in, can end up making students seem like they have less potential as learners in our classrooms. So this is often talked about as having a deficit orientation towards students. So what would an asset orientation look like? If the student was in my class, the C student who doesn't always do her work, has some risk factors in her demographic background, but she asks really good questions. And I'm gonna really hone in on that as a teacher and see that in her and tell her that I noticed that, right? That would be me looking at her with an asset orientation. I know that part of the reason she doesn't do her work is she's got a lot of responsibility at home. She takes care of younger siblings, she works a job after school, and I recognize the strength that that takes to take on all the responsibilities that she does in her home life. Doesn't mean I've given up on her as a student, though. Doesn't mean that I've excused her or written her off. I am going to work with her to figure out how she's going to develop her student skills despite the challenges that she has, building on the strengths that I see in her. That would be looking at this child with an asset orientation. And this asset orientation has been well documented in literature as being really critical for student achievement for some time. So this famous study in 1968 that would never pass IRB now, this study in 1968 by Rosenthal and Jacobson called Pygmalion in the Classroom, where they randomly assigned kids. They told teachers, these are the gifted kids. They have a lot of potential. These don't, and saw what happened to their achievement scores. You can't do that. It's not ethical. Oops, I just turned it off. Darn it. Pressed the wrong button. Where's my tech person? Oh, okay, we're good. Crisis averted. Okay, so there's been 45 years of research since the first study that's kind of parsed this phenomenon into teacher expectations, into differential treatment, and it's confirmed most of these ideas. These initial findings have really borne out. The thing that I think is really worth noting, given a lot of my commitments and the concerns that I think a lot of you share, is that students from socially stigmatized groups are especially vulnerable to teacher expectation effects. Just to keep that in mind. And in math education, we actually have a really well-documented form of what I would call an asset-oriented approach to teaching. And those are two books up there. The top one is an edited volume based on work done at a school that's known in the literature as Railside High School. And the lower one is a book that I wrote about this particular pedagogy that's called Complex Instruction. And there's no way in the midst of this talk I'm going to be able to do justice to all that complex instruction entails, but the things you need to know, along the theme of what I'm telling you today, is that this pedagogy really focuses on students' mathematical strengths through really deliberately through curriculum, through classroom design, and through teacher and student interactions, actually to the point of like designing how teachers should interact with kids to really bring out their strengths. Just for the mathematics people in the audience, one of the teachers who, she's a friend of mine, I'm not gonna lie. She wrote this poster for her classroom as she's a complex instruction approach in her classroom. And she really wants to broaden for kids what it means to be mathematically smart. So she's linked these different kinds of mathematical smartnesses to different mathematicians in a way of helping kids identify their own strengths and their own, realizing that quick and accurate calculation is not the only way to be smart in math, but there's a lot of very mathematically legitimate ways to be smart in math, and that kids can find themselves in there somewhere. So what has been documented about this approach? Well, at Railside High School, where math teachers use complex instruction, it was documented that compared to students in other forms of instruction, the students made greater achievement gains and that race-based achievement disparities narrowed. I did sort of a replication, asterisk, parentheses, study, trying to bring complex instruction to schools in Seattle when I was at University of Washington, and we got the same results. We found that students made greater achievement gains and that race-based achievement disparities narrowed as teachers got more proficient with this pedagogy. So I personally am persuaded that an asset orientation helps students learn mathematics. But what I'm trying to explore right now is this question: how does it help teachers learn to teach ambitiously? That chart that I showed you in the beginning with the left side and the right side, how does it move teachers toward that right side of the chart? Okay, ready to play connect the dots with me? Okay. Okay, what I'm going to do in this part is I'm going to walk you through 5 findings. I should probably keep the little kitty up there. I'm going to walk you through 5 different findings that to me point toward how critical this asset orientation is for teacher development, not just for student learning, okay? So bear with me. This is the part where like I really need you to hang in there, because there's going to be some weeds before we go back up to the forest. Oh, I just mixed metaphors. Trees before we, okay. I'm blaming the altitude for everything like that. Okay, so the first study I'm going to tell you about, and these are not in chronological order, it's more of a narrative order. Teachers make choices about what to learn when they're in professional education settings. So teachers' motivations to learn are rooted in their ideas of what good teaching is. So a workshop on discussion-intensive math classrooms is probably pretty wasted on a teacher who thinks that really what they need to do is explain things clearly. And students will either get it or not, right? So it's sort of an intuitive idea, but we really saw this play out in pretty powerful ways in this study. This was actually a social studies teacher who, at the time 1 of our data collection in pre-service education, thought that all the stuff we were doing around assessment development and rubric development was a crock, basically. She said, I will never sit and plan assessments like I did for that class. I would have no life outside of school. I would never give any sort of tests or projects because the amount of work that went into it, that's what that class taught me, that the amount of work that goes into assessing is like, who would ever assess anything? So we had taught in our teacher education program a really deliberate, kind of mindful, intentional way of assessing. She thought it was BS. She kind of played the game, but really didn't invest herself in learning that. Then she got hired at a school where that was the sort of shared practice of the faculty. So her vision of what good teaching was changed. She wanted to be seen as a legitimate member of that department, and they valued rigorous, carefully planned assessments. So this young woman, Gemma, then avowed the value of planning them. And the quote's too long but she was like, yeah, this is really a good idea. And she invested herself in learning how to understand assessment design in a way that she wasn't invested previously. So in other words, teachers decide, this is dot one, teachers decide what is worth learning based on their notions of good teaching. Okay, dot one, now up to dot two. The way math teachers frame emergent problems of practice matters for what they view is solvable. And what I mean by framing is this idea, some of you, if you read political stuff, you might have read George Lakoff's stuff about don't think of an elephant. It's that idea that framing describes the process through which we kind of define and construct problems in the world. So teachers are doing framing as they decide how to address the different instructional problems that come up. And that's what I hear when I'm planning my video tapes, my video cameras. There's no tapes anymore. Video cameras next to teacher groups as I'm hearing them frame problems. And it turns out that that's really consequential. And here's just an excerpt from a meeting where a couple of teachers had what I would call not a super productive frame about their students. The first teacher says, I don't think we can fly geometry. They're trying to figure out how to restructure their curriculum so that there's no more remedial courses. That was their mandate. Second teacher, Barbara, agrees. You brought it up and you're telling the truth that our kids cannot get through geometry as we teach it now. They discuss whether the kids can get through their geometry course. They talk about the foundations for geometry in the algebra textbook. And Barbara says, in this book that we have, they do formulas for circumference of a circle, similar triangles. What they won't be able to handle is the logic and the two-column proofs. Our regular kids can't handle it. One of the problems with these kids that we're taking out of the remedial courses is that they don't have the logic component. So the frame that she has around this problem of eliminating the remedial classes is that the kids aren't capable of engaging in these kind of higher levels of thinking, which then makes this problem that the district has imposed on them not really solvable. So these ideas that teachers have about these sort of critical aspects of their work, about students, about mathematics, about what it means to teach, are really consequential for what's actionable even in their world. Oh, right, what I just said. Dot number two. Teachers' identification and framing of teaching problems shape possible solutions. Number three. What changes as teachers improve? So in this project that we did in Seattle, where we got the same kind of results that Bullard, Staples, and other colleagues found at Railside School, one of my doctoral students, Nicole Bannister, followed a group of teachers really closely over the course of a year as they were measurably improving their practice. The thing that she found changed in their talk were the frames. The ways they framed problems changed noticeably. They went from intractable, sort of like what you just heard Barbara saying in that last quote, to actionable. I'll give you the example that Nicole uses in her paper. So there's a teacher in October who's talking about the student Taylor. And the way she's talking about Taylor, she says, I have the kid Taylor who's really flaky and doesn't know what's going on and is starting to annoy the rest of the group. So that's a really struggling kid, and they're starting to opt out. The way that Rose is describing Taylor, there's not a lot she can do about it. She's a really struggling kid. She's really flaky, bugging other kids. What can a teacher do? come May, Rose has a really different take on Taylor. He's not doing well now, but Taylor is so smart. And so here I'm at the end of the year and I'm thinking, why would I put him back in Math 1? She's dealing with this dilemma of whether to retain him and make him repeat the class. He obviously understands stuff. So now she's making a generalization about how we need to think about kids like Taylor. I think there are some kids we need to look at a little differently. There are some kids maybe we shouldn't really keep back because then we're really sentencing them to not ever be able to come out of that. Her framing of who Taylor is and the problem of his not achieving in her class has changed, and she's seeing a different course of action possible. And this is just one example. In Nicole's paper, she documents many examples of this shift. And this framing shift from intractable to actionable was most visible around the issue of struggling students. How teachers think about struggling students turned out to be a really fruitful place to see how their thinking was changing as they were getting better at ambitious teaching. So this is dot. What am I on, 3? Okay, frames change as teachers change, and struggling students are a useful place to look at these changes. Okay, there's 5 of them altogether, so bear with me. This is also from the MISS study. Again, you have to imagine the challenge that we had as researchers. We're trying to trace changes in teachers at the level of district. And we want them to be how we're capturing that to be authentic to what's happening in the classroom. And we want to be able to relate it back to what's going on in professional development and other professional learning opportunities. So the MISS team had to develop a number of different ways of capturing that. And one of the ways that Kara Jackson, who's at University of Washington, and some of her graduate students developed to capture this idea of framing was this idea of visions of students' mathematical capabilities. How do teachers envision what students are able to do mathematically? And what they found in their analysis was that unproductive framings of students' mathematical struggles are very prevalent, and they are related to teachers' decisions to lower the cognitive demand of tasks. So it's moving from that right side. So teachers are aiming for that right side of my little chart, and then kids are having trouble, and they retreat back to the left side of the chart. That's what I mean. And the way that this research team captured that is they looked at 122 middle school math teachers who were asked the question, when your students don't learn as expected, what do you find are typically the reasons? So they listened to teachers, how they diagnosed the problem, and then what they said they did in response to the problem. So there's a diagnostic aspect and a sort of prognostic aspect. And they coded whether the frames that teachers invoked were either productive or unproductive. Of those 122 teachers, about 30% attributed student struggles to some inherent traits or deficits. So they were already like, this is intractable, there's nothing I can do about it. Some students are just, that's how they are. But even among those who maybe had a little more hope about their students' capabilities, when they talked about what they did when students struggled, about 70% talked about doing that retreat, moving away from ambitious instruction in the face of student struggle. So student struggle is a really critical issue for teachers who are trying to improve, to get their head around. It's a big challenge to pushing teachers towards moving the dial on their practice. But I see this as related to this deficit framing. It's related to moving away from ambitious teaching. If I think that student struggle means they can't do it, because that's kind of what it means when you're moving away. You're enacting that they can't do it. Or maybe you just don't have the tools as a teacher to figure out how to support them through that. I don't know. But it's getting in the way of teachers developing this ambitious math teaching. Okay, last study. This one's pretty cool. It's a dissertation that just got defended not that long ago. And there's Charlotte Dunlap Sharp right there, because there's no journal to show here. It's just Charlotte and her dissertation. And she did this really interesting analysis to try to get at this question of when do math teachers improve? So we have all these data, right, on all these teachers and all these different measures and all this different information about their schools and their contexts and their school leaders and their professional development. And Charlotte wants to figure out, when do we see improvers? Because remember, we have those classroom-based measures of their instruction. When do we see improvers and when do we see decliners? So what she did was very clever. She built cases by looking within schools where there's improvers, decliners, and she also took a case that was stable, people who were stable, and looked at the contrasts across those three types of teachers in the different schools. And she looked at the different measures of expertise that we had developed on the project to help develop some explanation for improving versus declining. Okay, ready? This is exciting. I told Charlotte I was going to be sharing this today. It wasn't about the mathematical knowledge for teaching. That wasn't the key component. It wasn't about having a strong vision of ambitious instruction. That was a part of it, but that was not enough. There were people who had the strong vision, who could recite chapter and verse of principles to actions or Common Core, whatever your favorite Bible of ambitious instruction is. They could do that, but they still weren't improving. Having learning resources wasn't enough. So having a great coach in your building, having access to rich curriculum wasn't enough. Ready? Here's the big reveal. It was the strong vision of ambitious instruction, the learning resources, and the deal breaker was this asset orientation. Thinking students were capable. That was the thing that separated the improvers from the decliners and the people who remained stable. Isn't that interesting? If you don't think that's interesting, I did not do a good job telling the story, because I think it's super interesting that we've known for a really long time that this asset orientation is really consequential for kids learning. It's also consequential for teachers learning. It's sort of a linchpin for these instructional improvement projects that so many of us are involved with in various ways. Okay, so we're going to go back to connecting these dots. There's a lot of different connections to draw out here. I'm just going to take a few that surface for me. In those little bubbles or dots or whatever, those are the little orange letters that I had at the end of every dot. Okay, whatever. I probably overthought this. So just take those two findings, right? That teachers' framing of teaching problems shapes the possible solution paths, and deficit-oriented views of students are related to retreating from ambitious teaching, right? That kind of makes sense that those kind of seem to feed off of each other. If I don't think you're capable, then why would I even pursue a solution path to trying to improve? Why would I even seek out? You know, I got to this part of my lesson and the kids really struggled. Do you have any ideas of how I might have gotten them through that? Like, why would I even ask that question if I don't even see that as a possibility, right? Here, I'll take these two. Teachers decide what is worth learning based on their ideas of good teaching. And an asset-oriented view of students is critical to math teachers' instructional improvement. So if I go to my class every day and I look around and I know all of you are capable of something, that's how I'm looking at you. Those are the goggles I'm wearing. I'm going to keep thinking this is worth learning. I need to get better. This is on me. I have agency here that I need to invoke and exercise to get better. If I'm looking at you and going, oh, those kids. What motivation do I have to even pursue or seek out coaching or professional development? Not really there, right? Just to mix it up a little, let me take these three. Teachers decide what is worth learning based on what they think good teaching is. Teachers' framing of teaching problems shapes the possible solution paths. And teachers' frames shift as their instruction improves, especially around struggling students. So I'm starting to get better. I'm starting to see that I can actually make a difference in keeping kids with me in my instruction. Wow, my ideas about what good teaching is are changing. Oh my gosh, you know, when I have these problems arise in my classroom, I'm starting to see that maybe there's possibilities that I should seek out. There's probably solution paths that I haven't thought of, or maybe I'm starting to learn solution paths because I'm starting to see that I have agency here. I'm starting to see that there are possibilities for my action that could be consequential to the kids in my classroom. See what I'm getting at? You could tell I sit there listening to teachers a lot because I always want to like narrate this from a teacher's point of view. But takeaway, this is a really hard thing we're asking teachers to do. This is really hard to move from the left side of that chart to the right side of that chart. It's harder, it's more ambiguous. If I'm building my instruction on students' ideas, over time, I might start to learn what to anticipate when I introduce linear equations. But the first time I go in, or even if I go to a new school where I've never taught before, I might be used to what my last 9th grade class did in my old school. But this group of kids, they have a whole different set of ideas that I have to now contend with. And it's negotiated. My success feels more dependent on my students' response, which is an emotionally risky thing for teachers. That's a huge risk that they take. When they invest and when they listen and when they negotiate their practice. Now, frankly, the secret I have is that I think that teacher's practice is negotiated anyway. It's just whether or not they're paying attention to the feedback and input their students are giving them. That was just a little aside. Okay. What are the implications of this? To me, for teacher education, I think that these foundational questions we ask about teaching and learning are really critical and cannot fall off the table. We have to keep re-engaging these ideas about learning, about ability, about bias, about social stigma. I've become concerned that in the move that has taken place in university-based teacher education to move towards practice models, that some of these foundational courses and foundational ideas have not been as well attended to. I get in arguments about this at conferences with my colleagues who are passionate about practice-based teacher education, but I'm laying out that this is a commitment that I have and that I really think we need to think hard about what it means to get teachers to engage these issues, not by writing papers, not by talking in seminars, but engaging in a really full and integrated way. Teacher professional development. We really need to pay attention to the fact that teachers' motivations for ongoing learning are connected to having this asset orientation. I think in professional development in general, we don't do enough to cultivate, engage, or ask teachers what their motivations are for learning. What do you care about? What are you trying to get better at? Is not a question most teachers get asked. They get offered a slate of professional development workshops, pick one. Maybe they engage, maybe they sit in the back and grade papers because they have too much to do and not enough time. But it would be really interesting if instead we started hearing out what their concerns are, what their goals are for their own practice, and trying to frame that in an asset-oriented way so that we can sort of move them towards seeing students in this way. So what future work does this suggest? This is a question that I've been engaging with some of my colleagues at Vanderbilt, is this question of what teacher education pedagogies support the development of a deep asset orientation. So again, beyond just, I can write a paper or tell you about the social reproduction in schools, right? I mean, I actually understand how I'm a part of that system, and I need to be critical of it, and I need to kind of work against that and keep more students involved in my teaching. I also think we need to be critical of school structures because, gosh, 5 things popped in my mind about that bullet. I started teaching in the early mid-90s, and that was before No Child Left Behind. We already had a lot of mechanisms for sorting and ranking and labeling kids, but my goodness if that hasn't accelerated. I mean, Vicky's work talks about this and some of the risks of that. We have so much that sorts kids from such a young age, sorts and labels, and teachers are put in the position of treating those labels as if they're meaningful through mandates by their administrators. So having an asset-oriented view towards students in the midst of a system that mails home spreadsheets to parents that says your child is below basic. It's a really, really challenging task. And again, I'm very humble about the challenge that that poses to teachers. So it's funny, even though I started this talk by telling you how I try to move away from the ideal discourse of teacher education and schooling, doesn't mean I'm not an idealist in my heart. And I recognize that this last, we have a lot going against us right now about thinking hard about what school structures can help teachers sustain an asset orientation to the children in their classroom. But I'm still going to hold on to that as an ideal, even though I'm not naive. I recognize how much is pushing in the other direction. So that is the end of my talk. I thank you, and I welcome an opportunity for questions. I'm sorry? So in the study I was referring to, we had those videos that we took once a year, and we told the teachers, show us your best lesson. So then we had an instrument called the Instructional Quality Assessment. I think it's a 6-part rubric.
We had reader reliability, there's different subsections, there's the potential of the tasks, there's the quality of the discourse. There's a whole bunch of different subcodes on that, and we gather that data every year.
So we had a very content-specific, classroom-based assessment to track instructional quality over time.
What was it called?
Instructional Quality Assessment. Melissa Boston is the main designer. It came out of University of Pittsburgh, LRDC. So you look that up, yeah.
I'm curious, when you asked them about their best lessons, was it something that they thought, oh, this was my favorite lesson that I produced, and so I'm going to be videotaped on my own, giving it as a lecture, or
No,
they
no.
wanted it in their class?
In their classroom. So it was in their classroom. So we would let them do things like, please don't come and film my 3rd period. I have not been able to get a handle on them. Come to 4th period. And they knew sort of what the district was going for instructionally. So it wasn't a trick. And they had a lot of ability to say, you can't go in that class. I'm comfortable with you filming in that class. So they could really show us their best. We were not out to get teachers. We weren't trying to play a game of gotcha. We wanted to say, show us what you can do, and give them an opportunity to really do that.
Did you share your results with them?
The district was our main partners, and they were the ones who got to hear all of this stuff as it emerged. I don't know what channels we ended up having really to communicate with teachers. I think it was a little different from district to district as well. Yeah. No, I don't think so, because we would film them usually between February and April. So it wasn't the beginning of the year. They usually had a good chance to have established their classroom community and norms. And yes, a lot of these schools had transient student populations where, within, again, asterisk, there's some qualifiers there, but generally, they were able to do that. And they also could say no. They didn't have to. That's how research works. Post Pygmalion in the classroom. We have IRBs now. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I do, but I'll wait for you.
Well, mine might take a while.
Well, mine's sort of a meta question.
Okay.
So we raised the level one. I would characterize our society, almost all of us, our attitude toward teachers rather than students, as deficit oriented.
Yes, we do. I agree with you.
We work in almost any field we're asked what's wrong with teaching, here's what teachers ought to do. So how do we
I appreciate that question because that is a huge impetus behind my work. It's part of why I want to sit and listen to teachers and hold up a mirror and talk back to the field that traffics in these ideals and say, you know how hard this is? This is really, really hard. Listen to all this stuff the teachers are having to figure out. The teachers who are committed in taking this seriously, they are taking on a very challenging task. Now, if I were queen of the universe, which I'm not, teachers would have, their time would be totally structured totally differently. There is no way I would give people 150 to 200 students a day with 50 minutes of planning and think that they could do this. I mean, the ones who are able to are my absolute heroes, and I hope that they live a good, long, healthy life. Because that's really hard to sustain when that's how your work time is structured. I mean, just right off the bat, the little calculation that I tell people is that my first year of teaching, I had 180 student contacts in a 50-minute planning period. If I spent 1 minute a day looking at their work, that was 3 hours. So already we see that's a huge misalignment, because what can you see in 1 minute? I had a 50-minute plan a period, and sometimes I needed to call home. And I also needed to use the bathroom. And you know, like, that is ridiculous. The work conditions that we put teachers in and ask them to do really hard work isn't reasonable. So yes, we can keep wagging our fingers at teachers and saying they're not doing enough, but I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's right. And I hope eventually when I am queen of the universe to be able to change the work conditions of teachers. So, Irene, you had a question?
Yeah, I think it connects to this nicely. Like, one thought led to like one actual question. So one of the things that I was thinking when you were describing the way teachers frame the struggling students is that really it's because teaching is an active learning experience. It's really the teacher's struggle. It's not only the student's struggle.
Yeah.
Because the teacher's struggle to figure out what to do about the student's struggle. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that also made me wonder is like, when you mentioned reading your talk that many of the deficits discourses or flags come out for students with like socially marginalized positions or whatever it was. How have you made the choice about when or when not to talk about things like race or language or ability or?
I'm not always leading the professional development. A lot of the time I'm listening and observing. And I do think that in general, teachers who have the capacity within their group, their community, their school to address and engage those issues are able to go further in terms of having an asset orientation. Because part of what they're doing is they're learning to unsee the broader narratives about different groups of students in their classrooms, right? So I think being able to engage in issues of race, gender sometimes.
Or even like coding, right? So
Yeah,
that it's
right.
not really talking about it
Right,
unless if there's
right. Well, that's your work. Yeah.
So that, okay, but you are seeing some people like learning to unframe those or deframe those.
Yeah, to challenge those framings and to challenge the deficit views that are tied rhetorically to sort of these big narratives we have about groups of kids in schools. Okay, there's so many questions, and I don't know anybody's name. And Paula, hi.
Hi. So how have you conceptualized or seen teachers' work change as a result of collaboration, like PLCs?
Right. So that's actually a lot of my research is around PLCs. And okay. My sort of one-liner on what PLCs can do is it's a rich get richer situation. That if you have teachers who are really like oriented toward developing ambitious instruction, asset oriented towards kids, they're going to see things in their classroom and bring it back to the PLC with the idea this is something we can do something about rather. So once you kind of have those things, a PLC can become a really productive place for working on those problems of practice. If you think your job as a teacher is to present ideas clearly and keep up with the curriculum and maybe the kids will get it and maybe they won't. A PLC is not going to in itself transform that perspective, and it's not going to necessarily do much to shift. Teachers love PLCs anyway, even if all they're doing is getting help, lesson planning, getting the emotional support of, oh my gosh, this thing happened in fourth period. I don't know why I'm fourth period today. Sixth period, you know, when the fire drill went off, and they get to vent to each other. That, like, teachers love that. And my goodness, their job satisfaction and their sense of whether or not they've done well, they are beholden to a group of adolescents. It's a little bit demeaning when you think about it, right? I mean, I love adolescents. I have 2 teenage daughters. But still, there's not adults in the room going, yeah, don't worry about that. That was, you know, there's no like reality check. So if the kids aren't happy, then it's hard to feel good about what you've done, right? Okay, there's a whole bunch of other, okay. I'm starting in the back for some reason. Yeah.
So, have you looked at asset orientation in teaching outside the U.S., or have you only looked at schools?
That's a great question. My work has all been in the U.S. I have had a chance to work with colleagues who work outside of the U.S. context. You know, schooling functions so differently. The sorting and labeling mechanisms work so differently. Teachers' working lives are so different. There's a lot of different things that go on, but it is, but I'm just saying that I think that part of what I meant in that little speech I gave on my last bullet about like how I'm really an idealist at heart, but like my soul is being crushed right now, is that there are ways in which these ideas get reinforced by the social organization. And so I suspect in a place like Finland, where maybe they don't do so much sorting and ranking of kids, I bet it's easier to have an asset orientation towards the kids in your group because you're not getting these spreadsheets with red, yellow, and green columns on it with children's names on the side, right? How do you see a child who's in the red column in a strengths-based way when you're being told by your principal you need to get him out of that red column? You know, they don't have that. And I think that, you know what I mean? So it filters down. Or it reinforces problematic things. You know, I can't really point to a causal direction, but it certainly does not help. Yes. You're next. No, don't. You're leaving? Oh, I'm sorry. I would have asked you if I'd known. Somebody should have told me. Yes. No, you're fine. I didn't know either.
I was just wondering if I mean, I imagine students who are struggling assume that there is a deficit orientation towards them, just naturally. I wonder if teachers tell the students that they have this asset orientation and that affects student performance and the trauma.
So in the schools, the classrooms I know the most closely where there's this deliberate strengths-based approach, asset orientation cultivated. That poster that I showed you that my friend Peg made, that's on the wall, right? And she tells her students, find yourself. You've got something like this. Which is your mathematical strength, right? But on another level, all that Pygmalion in the classroom, implicit bias, research talks about the way the interactions play out. Even if teachers aren't being told anything about assets or deficits, it's like, how do I respond as a teacher when we're having a little instructional dialogue and you give me the wrong answer? Do I turn away from you because, oh, you're just one of those kids? Or do I give you the message through my interaction, no, you can get this? By maybe scaffolding you a little bit, giving you, well, have you thought about that? What if you turn it this way, right? And just that act of sticking with kids longer, that was one of the things in the original Pygmalion in the classroom study that they found was a difference between they're the gifted kids, they're not the gifted kids. That teachers did in interaction with the kids was sticking with them longer when kids encountered difficulty. Yeah.
Are there any particular patterns or types of supports that
Yeah, I mean, in the study that I was talking about that Nicole Bannister's dissertation came out of, we kept pushing on that in various ways, but one of the things we did that I think was pretty powerful was by October in the school year, we had the teachers compile a list of who looks like they're getting a D or F. Let's look now. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on. We had them code that list with a reason. Why do you think they're getting a D or F? Low prior achievement, not turning in homework, freezes up at tests, chronic absenteeism. And we looked at that list to try to understand better, and then we also took that list and we went into the counseling office and we pulled the CUME files of all those kids. And we had the teachers look at their academic histories. One of the things the teachers noticed in doing that was they saw that a lot of those kids on that DF list had been transitioned out of the ELL program. A lot of those kids had been transitioned out of special ed, but there had been no communication to them. By the way, this is their first year in a mainstream math class. There was one girl, I'll never forget this, the teacher felt horrible. There was something in her CUME file that said, last year she lost her hearing aid and didn't get it replaced. And the girl was sitting in the back of her classroom. And she was like, oh, why did nobody tell me this? There were kids who had phenomenal academic histories in grades K through 8 or K through 7, and then there was a terrible drop-off. And that made the teachers think to themselves, what happened in 8th grade? So it added sort of a longitudinal picture on who these children were and where they were coming from and the things they were transitioning out of and possible struggles they were contending with. Who knows what happened to the children who had these sudden academic drop-offs? Was it a terrible teacher? Was it a crisis in their life? You know, we don't know, but it raised questions that I felt shifted the way teachers started thinking differently. I think part of what happens in schools and classrooms a lot of the time is teachers see kids here now in this space, and they end up with this really kind of narrow view of who children are. And I know there's been a lot of interventions about, you know, shadowing kids over full days, seeing them in their areas of strength. I know a lot of experienced teachers who really make a point of going to extracurriculars, to see kids' performances, to see kids on the sports field, just so that they have a way of engaging with kids around their strengths, right? So I think that's kind of a known thing, that sometimes the slice of children that we see in our classrooms is a narrow slice, and it may not be their most shining slice. But this sort of added this longitudinal piece of not just beyond the walls of my classroom who are these children, but what have their histories been up until this point? And what does that tell me about what they might need from me by way of support to be successful? Yes?
So we have a lot of grad students here from the math department, and I'm just curious, what wisdom would you have to share about how to apply these same ideals into the college classrooms that we're teaching?
Oh, thank you for that
Some
question.
of them are very large classrooms.
Right. So how do you give students an idea that there's more to math than finishing your problem set correctly, right? So are there puzzles you can have students do, like a turn and talk? So even in a context of a large lecture hall, can you give them a chance to sort of make their own sense of ideas? Can you, I mean, I think that there are tools and structures out there for getting students to engage and make mathematics as opposed to just learning the received mathematics. I think that these interactions in office hours can be really helpful. I think that we think about the messaging we give about who's good at math. Even things like pacing, right? Do we write up a problem for students to work at their seats, and then do we reward the quickest? Or do we make a space and say, you know what, I'm going to give you all 2 minutes, which maybe is twice as long as you think they need. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. If you finish early, you can turn and talk to a partner, so that you're normalizing a slower pace and allowing for broader connections to be made. There's a lot that I think can be done to communicate the sort of ambitious ideals, even within the context of a large lecture class. I don't know how long I'm supposed to keep answering.
Maybe it's the last
Okay. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned one of the teachers you talked to reflect back on her experience in teacher education about
Yeah.
assessments. So, did teachers ever have that same kind of reflection on being taught about asset orientation?
Not in my data set, but it doesn't mean it's not. Obviously, that's something that very likely probably has happened to some teachers somewhere. I can't think of an example of that, but yeah, probably somewhere. So
Okay, well, let's take a moment to thank our speaker.
thank you all for your good questions. Thank you.